I just wanted to give a shout out before this video begins. This is one of my favorite threads, and if you want to hear this story from a real voice, I recommend his channel. YouTube doesn't allow me to add links, so I will put a screenshot of his channel here. Anyways, hope you enjoy, and on to the spookies.
Hello/X/. After a lot of thinking, and a couple of drinks, I have finally decided to share some of my experiences. English is not my native language, so forgive me if my grammar isn't perfect. Be me. Late 1990s. Work in a very rural area of Russia, as a sort of ranger/wildlife preservationist. In Russia we don't have the same regulations and strict protocol as some of you might. We more or less just drive around on ATVs and berate poachers, while we ensure the safety of the deer population and shit like that. I worked in a rural area, surrounded by forest and harsh wilderness. Only had one colleague, who we'll call Peter, it's short and easy to remember. Peter was your typical backwash crazy Russian dude, who brewed his own vodka and smoked like a chimney. He was my best friend for several years, and always had my back no matter what we faced out there in the woods. The job had shit pay, but it came with loads of perks that made it worth it. We had no boss, and could basically just go camping, get wasted and call it an excursion. I will admit that we once or twice hustled some innocent hunters from their money, by claiming that they were poaching. We were corrupt as fuck, but still managed to make some decent arrests and put some real poachers behind bars. But sometimes we got calls that required us to do some actual hard work. If people spotted sick animals, it fell upon us to go out there and make sure it didn't spread. If an animal showed aggressive behavior that might endanger the locals, we had to ensure that the animal got put down. We had friends at the local vet who would run blood samples if we suspected rabies or something else. One day Peter and I got a call from some pretty spooked locals. They told us that some boys had gone hunting a couple days ago, but none of them had returned. They all believed that they had been killed by bears or wolves. Great. Now we have to venture into the wilderness for some potentially aggressive carnivores. They point us in a general direction, and we take off on our ATVs. We drive around the area for about 3 hours, when we find an abandoned campsite. It was evident that the camp had been trashed by something, probably a bear. By the looks of it, the boys had left camp in a hurry, not even bringing their rifles. From then on we went on foot, with our guns drawn, just in case. We found the first corpse a few meters away from their camp. He was lying on his stomach, with several deep wounds to his back. What struck us as weird, was that it was deep puncture wounds, which we had never before seen in a bear or wolf attack. There was a clear path, which indicated where the other boys had fled. We found 2 boys in the same small area, both of them lying dead with similar wounds. One of them had practically been gutted. Peter was visibly shaken by this scene, and just kept shaking his head in disbelief. According to the locals, there was supposed to be 4 boys out here, so we were still missing one. We both tactically shat our pants, when we heard something rustling through the brush towards us. We aimed at the commotion and waited for it to reveal itself before we shot. I almost dropped my rifle when it emerged from the dense bushes. It was a red stag, with the mangled remains of the 4th boy stuck in its antlers. It had trouble holding its balance under the weight of the boy, but still bellowed aggressively, as if it was about to charge us. Peter was the first to snap out of the shock, and started lighting the fucking thing up. Upon further inspection we noticed that its antlers were worn down and broken. It had put an excessive amount of force behind each of its charges, breaking its antlers on the poor boys. The reason the 4th boy was stuck in the antlers, was because the damn thing had practically torn through his rib cage. We couldn't separate the boy from the antlers, so we had to bring the head with us. It was one of the most fucked up rides home, with the cargo of several corpses tied to the back of our ATVs. The local authorities were pretty angry at us, seeing as we had moved bodies from a potential crime scene, but let us off easy, seeing as the killer was literally embedded into one of the victims. Seeing the heartbroken parents of these boys still haunts me. That night I hung out with Peter, mostly because I was still pretty spooked. That shit wasn't natural, he said at one point. Deer can be aggressive and defend against predators, yes. But this fucker hunted down those boys and killed them all. They don't do that shit. That was the first time I caught a glimpse of the spooky shit that goes on out there. In the following years I saw some deeply insane shit that only Peter and I know about. I will share the stories with you, and hopefully you will believe me and understand why I'm scared shitless every time I see a deer. About once or twice a month, we had to go on excursions into the wilderness to look for signs of poachers, sick animals and other stuff like that. One time we decided to drive out to a fairly secluded area, because there were rumors of some potential poaching. It was a very long drive, so we had always put it off, praying that the poachers would just get mauled by bears, so that we didn't have to make the long journey. We had to drive for about 15 hours. Before the terrain became too difficult for the ATVs to handle. We had to walk the rest of the way, which meant we had to camp out. I was pretty uneasy when night came. Camping out is a norm for us, but we were further away from civilization than we had been before, and the previous incidents still haunted my mind. Peter offered me a bottle to ease my worries, but I didn't want to be intoxicated in case we were attacked by some demonic deer. The night went by without an incident, but I still didn't get a lot of sleep. We continued on our trek toward the supposed poacher hotspot. We arrived, looked around but found nothing. There didn't seem to be any sign of human activity anywhere in the area. Fucking rumors, Peter mumbled to himself as he shook his head in frustration. Normally we should be happy to find nothing, but this time we were just exhausted and cranky. We were then startled by a loud bellowing echoing through the forest. What the fuck was that? Peter pulled out his rifle and aimed in the direction of the noise. Though it went against our instincts, we had to go investigate it. We reached a small ridge that overlooked a clearing. In the middle of the clearing a group of 5 stags were huddled together. Their heads were bowed down, as if they were grazing. We noticed they all seemed to make sudden, violent jerking motions, like they were trying to gore the ground with their antlers. Peter fired a shot into the air, trying to make them scatter. They didn't fucking move. If you have any basic knowledge on wildlife, you know that sudden loud noises makes just about any animal take off running. We fired a couple more shots into the air, but they still didn't react. In a small moment of madness, we decided to calmly approach them, to get a better look at what the fuck they were doing. As we approached them, we were met with the nasty stench of rot and shit. Is that a fucking bear? Peter gestured to the ground in front of the stags. To our collective bewilderment, there was a large, adult brown bear. It was in a stage of decomposition, which meant it had been dead for at least 4 or 5 days. The stags were panting and groaning as they continuously gored the carcass over and over again. They looked seriously malnourished and exhausted. The bear's body was completely ripped apart, except for the head, which they for some reason had left completely unscathed. We stood frozen to the ground as we watched this horrible scene unfold. How did they take down a bear? How the actual fuck is that possible? I asked Peter. He shook his head in disbelief. As he raised his rifle and shot one of the stags, he later explained that he wanted a blood sample. As soon as the stag fell to the ground, the others stopped what they were doing and just turned to look at us. They were covered in rotting blood and chunks of meat. They didn't charge or show any aggressive behavior. They just stared at us, unflinching and unblinking. Peter had changed his mind about the blood sample at this point, and just slowly started backing away. I followed suit, and raised my rifle, just in case. When we reached the ridge, they resumed their mauling. once again not paying any attention to us. We were fucking done at this point. We didn't set up camp that night, and just kept hiking at a brisk pace until we reached our ATVs. None of us spoke a word the entire ride home, except for the occasional fuck. That incident really fucked something up in Peter. It took him a couple of weeks before he went with me into the forest again. He was completely convinced that the stags were being manipulated by a witch or something, which I'm not really sure of. I don't really believe in witches and all that, I just believe that nature is a lot more fucked than we believe. We have been away from real, raw nature for so long because we chose to live in cities, that we have likely forgotten how scary and unpredictable it can be. Still, there was something off about those stags. Still don't have an explanation. One day we got a call from the local authorities. Apparently some old man that lived by himself in a remote cabin had not been seen in a while. They wanted us to take them to the cabin, since they weren't used to terrain other than paved streets. We drove them out to the cabin, and parked a few meters from the front door. It was already pretty clear that something had happened. The door was completely knocked off its hinges. Cabin was empty. The officers asked us to assist them in their search, and we agreed. The initial theory was that he had been taken away by a bear, which seemed pretty plausible considering the fucked door. We spread out and followed whatever trails we could find. It took about half an hour before one of the officers called something in. He sounded a little shaken, but gave us detailed directions to where he was. He didn't tell us what he had found, but instead said, "You'll wanna see this yourselves." When we reached him, it wasn't clear what he had found, since nothing looked out of place. No broken branches, no trail, no nothing. He just pointed up into a large tree in front of him. Slung over one of the higher branches was a fresh deer carcass. This was certainly odd, but we still didn't get what this had to do with the case. Then we noticed something even stranger. Further up the tree, there was a bear carcass. Something had killed a bear, and then placed it in the tree. I knew that leopards and other big cats did this for later consumption. But there are no leopards or tigers where this took place. The officers looked uneasy, and took nervous glances over their shoulders. We stayed as a group after that, and looked around for another couple of hours before we called it. On our way back, we once again passed the tree. The deer was gone, only leaving some bloody branches behind. We picked up the pace and made our way out of there without looking back. There was a winter where we had a pretty horrible incident. As you would probably expect, the winters can be pretty rough, with a shit ton of snow and minus 40 degrees Celsius. If someone goes missing, they are immediately presumed dead, because it's impossible to maintain your core temperature for long durations, without being properly equipped. And when someone's child goes missing, it's just the worst. The police once again requested our assistance, because a mother had reported her 6-year-old daughter missing. The thought of spending hours in the biting cold was not welcoming, but we couldn't possibly turn a blind eye to a missing child. The mother had let her children play outside, when one of them had simply started running towards the tree line. They had been out there for some time, calling out her name, but they just couldn't find her. That's when they called the police, who then called us. By the time we arrived at the search area, she had been missing for about 2 hours. We followed a trail that we suspected were hers. It went on for way longer than what a child that age should be able to run. Then it just stopped. There was no sidestepping, scuffling or any sign of, well, anything. It was like she had just vanished on the spot. We examined the tracks, to see if she had backtracked or something, but there was no clear sign of any double prints. Peter was visibly upset, and frustrated. We asked the other kids why she had started running into the forest. They had no clear answer, but claimed that she just started running without any warning. The kids were shaking and crying, so we asked the mother to return to their home while we kept looking. An officer followed them back to their house, so that they felt safer. About 15 minutes later, one of the other officers got a call on their walkie-talkie. We could hear the distinct sound of the mother wailing in the background. They had found the girl. They had found her just sitting on the step to their back door. She was dead, and almost frozen solid. She had only worn a regular jacket and pants, considering that she was just supposed to play outside for a little while. The mother had locked the doors before they left, because she didn't want their house to get robbed while they were away. To this day I tear up when I think about it. But I still have some unanswered questions as to what had happened. The obvious solution is that she had returned home, and frozen to death when she couldn't get in. But I still think there's more to it. If she had run back, how did none of her siblings or her mother notice her? Why didn't she respond to their calls? How did she run back without leaving any tracks? How was she almost frozen solid, even though she had only been missing for about 4 hours? None of the neighbors had seen anything unusual, so there was nothing to investigate. The mother blamed herself, and became an alcoholic. I still think about that incident every day. For some reason it hit harder than the 4 boys who had been mauled. Here are a few shorter incidents that can't be made into very detailed stories. I once saw a deer mother bite one of her fawns by the head, and start shaking it violently until its neck snapped. She then dropped it to the ground, and nudged it a couple of times, as if it didn't quite understand what she had done. Didn't stay to observe, because I was a bit freaked out. Found a dead deer lying next to a tree. Markings on the tree, coupled up with markings on the deer's head, suggested that it had rammed its head into the tree's trunk until it died. Took a blood sample. Completely healthy. Stumbled upon a fresh kill in the winter. A deer with half of its face/neck missing. A large hole in its abdomen, with guts hanging out. As I poke the wound, in order to check the temperature, the fucking thing lets out a yelp, and rises to its feet, in complete disbelief, as this bloody mess turns its head to look at me, and starts walking away calmly. Collapses after about 10 meters, and doesn't get back up. This will be the last from me for now. I am pretty tired, and it's exhausting to relive all these horrible memories. I may post more tomorrow, but for now I will leave you with this. I had been seeing a girl for a couple of weeks. For some reason she found my job hot, and thought I was some sort of macho dude. Went along with it, because she was hot. She also hooked Peter up with one of her friends. She lived in one of the fancier houses in town, with a nice view of the forest from their living room. We decided to have a double date at her house, where we would watch a movie and eat dinner. Of course it didn't take long before Peter went to the guest room with his girl. I decided not to waste time either, and started sexy time as well. At this point I admit I had neglected my duties a bit. Peter and I hadn't even been to the forest that month, and hadn't responded to any calls regarding sick animals or poachers. We had gotten caught up in our own personal lives. It honestly felt nice to get a break from the work, seeing as we weren't exactly ever off duty. We fell asleep on the couch, in the living room. At some point during the night I woke up. It was a beautiful, starry night. Walked up to the glass door, leading to the terrace, in order to get a better view of the sky. After a few minutes, I spot something in the distance. The faint glow of eyeshine, from something staring intensely at me. I froze in place, and observed this unknown creature, as it slowly started walking towards me. When it got within the light emanating from the house, it revealed itself to be a medium-sized red stag. It just kept walking towards me, never blinking or taking its eyes off me. It walked directly into the glass, which seemed to puzzle it. It started nudging the glass, which turned into violent pushing. At this point I started backing away, still in complete disbelief at what was transpiring in front of me. Girlfriend wakes up, due to the loud banging on the glass. WTF is going on? Anon? She asks, still half asleep. Before I can answer her, the stag starts letting out these guttural screams. As it intensifies its ramming, it breaks through the glass. Girlfriend screams, and Peter comes running down the stairs to see what's going on. The stag just calmly walks up to me, like it hasn't just broken through a glass door. Keeps letting out those horrible noises as it just approaches me. I tried backing up, but stepped in some glass and fell over on my ass. The stag just observed me with unflinching eyes, as it kept bellowing. Girlfriend was still screaming. I'm suddenly deafened by the sound of Peter unloading his small sidearm. Hit the stag multiple times, but mainly missed, leading to a lot of property damage. The stag falls to the floor with a wet thud. To this day I am still grateful to Peter for bringing his gun. Girlfriend broke up the next day. She said that I was either cursed or unlucky, either way she didn't want anything to do with me. I still always sleep with my blinds on. I never want to see another window into the night, especially when I know what might be on the other side of that glass. I may have ignored the forest, but it certainly didn't ignore me. I have returned. I will share a couple more stories with you. I once found myself lost with Peter in a snowstorm. We were basically as fucked as we could ever be, with no shelter or any way to start a fire. Snow was falling so densely that we couldn't see more than a few meters in front of us. Wind was so cold that my lips started bleeding. We drove around for what felt like an eternity, until we came upon an old, decrepit hunting cabin. We had difficulty dismounting our ATVs, because our clothes were frozen solid. I still remember how Peter was shaking, and clacking his teeth. The cabin was completely empty, but had a simple fireplace and some semi-dry wood. As we sat there, slowly warming up by the fire, we had a moment of absolute dread, when we realized that we might actually fucking die. We had no idea how long the storm would last, and there wasn't a whole lot of wood for us to burn. Peter then rose to his feet and muttered, "Fuck it, wait here anon." He went outside, and returned a few minutes later with an axe. For a brief second I legitimately wondered if he was gonna put me out of my misery. To my relief he started beating the ever-loving shit out of the floorboards. Use this as firewood. It should keep the fire going for a while longer. Bless you, Peter, and your demented brain. In the end we probably burned about half of the cabin's floor, which revealed more and more of the cold dirt underneath. And of course there happened to be the remains of a couple of people down there. We were waiting out the storm, stuck in a fucking murder cabin. The remains looked very old. Fortunately, just dusty skeletal remains. Seriously debated whether we should leave or stay. Decided to stay, because we'd have a better chance of survival against a psycho Russian killer than the storm. At one point I swear we heard someone approaching the cabin, only to run away into the wilderness. Makes no sense, because only a mentally deranged mongoloid would have the balls to wander around out there. Then again, we were in a cabin with corpses under the floorboards. We sat with our rifles ready, just in case. After a long while, the storm started winding down. We emerged from the cabin, dug our ATVs out of the snow and made our way back to town. Navigating was a lot easier, now that we could see where we were going. Immediately went to the police station. They were surprised to see us, since they had already reported us missing/dead. We told them about the cabin, and agreed to show them the way the next day. I slept for about 14 hours, after soaking in a tub of hot water, best sleep I've ever had. We met up with the officers, and led them through the forest to the cabin. It was fucking gone. There was no trace to be found of it whatsoever. The trails left behind from our ATVs were still very clear, and even the spot where we dug them out. But the cabin was just not there. There was a clear area, where it had been, but there was nothing but a fresh layer of snow. The officers looked irritated, and said that we were wasting their time. They said that we must have been hallucinating, or that we drank too much of Peter's homebrew. It still makes no sense to me. Never found an explanation. Peter and I had been on one of our excursions in early autumn, when we came across a panicked hunter. He begged us to help his friend, who had been attacked by a bear further up the trail. He drove with us up to where the incident had occurred, but it was already too late. His friend was fucked up beyond belief, face ripped off, gutted and limbs bending in unnatural positions. Almost threw up at the sight. We decided that this bear was too dangerous to be left alive, since it was roaming fairly close to town. We started looking for tracks, to get an idea of where it was headed. The hunter was just sitting up against a tree, too shocked to react to what was going on. He kept describing the creature as a bear, when we asked him. The thing is, we only found deer tracks at the scene. Against our better judgment, we started tracking the fucker. I swear there was a constant stream of cold sweat running down my back, while we hunted this nasty motherfucker. Would honestly rather have been tracking a bear at this point. We reached a clearing at some point, where we found a piece of the guy's face hanging from a thorny bush. We were shitting enough bricks to build a new Berlin Wall at this point, but we trekked on. We finally caught sight of the fucker. It wandered aimlessly around in circles, almost like its internal compass was fucking up. This time, I was the one who shot it. Couldn't let Peter have all the fun. Hit it in the head. Instant death. Chunks of flesh were still hanging from its antlers. We had to collect the individual pieces, and put them in a plastic bag, so that we could deliver it to the morgue with the rest of the body. We gagged. As we did it, it was so fucking horrible. Ended driving the shocked hunter back with us, so that he could deliver his testimony. "Why did you tell us it was a bear?" Peter asked him. "You would never have believed me," he answered. "If only you knew." Peter and I were hanging out in his apartment one night, sharing stories and drinking. Sat out on his small balcony, and smoked when we got a call from the police station. There had been strange sightings of a large animal, presumably a bear, roaming the area. Some locals were pretty spooked, and had reported it to the police. Of course it fell under our jurisdiction. We decided that we would check it out in the morning. We didn't feel like chasing some large unidentified creature, while we were half drunk and the sun had gone down. Sit for a few more minutes, just chatting, when a deafening screech echoed out from beyond the tree line. We were silent for a couple of minutes. "Fuck me. That was loud," Peter said. "No shit, jackass." We decide to check it out. Operation Half-Drunk Russians Packing Heat commenced. We wandered around aimlessly, randomly pointing our flashlights and rifles around in the dark. "You've got to be fucking kidding me," Peter shouted out. He had found large cloven footprints. "Don't tell me this is another fucking deer, I swear to God." He sounded both angry and scared shitless. Rustling behind us. We both instantly turn, and aim at the sound. Two glowing eyes reflect our flashlights. It lets out a loud fucking squeal, and charges at us. We both light it the fuck up, while we shit our pants. It's a boar. A fucking boar. But it was so fucking big, that we initially thought it was a bear. Pic related is eerily similar to the bastard we shot. "At least it wasn't a fucking deer," I said. Peter let out a nervous laugh,
and shook his head in awe of the fucking beast lying before us.
Honestly didn't know what to do with it. We hadn't brought our ATVs, and the thing was way too heavy to carry. Decided to just leave it, for the wolves to scavenge. Police actually believed us this time. Some of the hogs out there can grow to enormous sizes, you're lucky it didn't get you. Another thing to worry about, fucking great. Most people don't know this, but there are loads of unmapped/unexplored cave systems all around Russia. This is also the case for where I lived. It wasn't uncommon for Peter and I to stumble upon a cave or two. while we were on our excursions. Lots of local legends surround the caves, like an underground city of subterranean people, covens of witches, prehistoric animals and so on. Whatever the case, I've always found cave systems fascinating. It's like entering a new world, where the same rules don't apply. So when the police mounted a rescue team to help a teenager who had gotten trapped in one of our caves, I didn't hesitate to volunteer. At this point, Peter and I were respected and well liked with the police. They trusted us, and included us in some of their work. Peter didn't come along this time, because he was too hungover. As the case stood, two teenage boys had tried to explore a local cave system that had some very steep drop-offs. One of the boys had lost his footing, and tumbled down into the darkness. He was still alive, but had broken his ankle, and couldn't get out. Rather than getting stuck himself, his friend had chosen to send for help. We made our way through the cave, making sure to watch our steps. The cave floor was damp, and covered with algae, so it wasn't a surprise that the boy had slipped. When we came to the drop-off, we shone our lights down at him. He waved, and smiled, knowing he was saved. I started descending the steep rock wall, with a rope tied at my waist. When I reached the bottom, I secured the boy to the rope, and gave the officers the signal to start pulling him up. He went that way, the boy said to me, and pointed to a narrow passageway at the back of the cave. "Excuse me?" I asked, wondering if he had hit his head on his way down. "My friend. He came back for me, and told me he had found an exit that way." I was confused, but told him, "Your friend is up there, with the others." His face went completely pale on the spot. "But he was down here with me. He went that way." An uneasy feeling hit me, which I tried to ignore. Now I was stuck at the bottom of this small chasm, until they threw down the rope again. And this kid claims that someone was down here with him, even though his friend had gone straight to the police. I felt very exposed, and kept focusing on the narrow passage at the back of the cave. I point my flashlight to the ground, and find fucking footprints leading into the passage. Fucking bare feet. Fuck. Just as I am unloading a metric fuckton of bricks, they throw the end of the rope down, and hit me right on my shoulder. I let out a shriek of terror, that those bastards never let me live down. As they pulled me up, I refused to look back down. Got the fuck out of there as fast as possible. Fuck whatever was down there. One of our biggest problems with poachers was that they would sometimes leave behind these heavy-duty, rusty bear traps. Pick related for reference. Sometimes they never came back for them, which meant that some parts of the forest could potentially be a minefield of broken ankles. Sometimes we would find rotting carcasses that had become trapped in one and left to die. I once almost stepped in one, but Peter noticed the chain in time to stop me. "Thanks again, buddy." One time we came across one of these traps, which had been sprung. Left in the trap was a boot, with the foot still attached. The rest of the body was gone. Large pool of blood left behind, along with bloody pieces of fabric. From what we could see, it looked like someone had gotten stuck, and then had his foot amputated. We followed the blood trail, but found no body. He must have been with a friend, who drove him out of there. The ironic part is, that bear traps are fairly easy to break out of, if you know which pin to pull. Poor guy lost his foot, because of some dumbass poacher. Took the foot with us, and asked around in the police station. They hadn't had any reports of people getting fucked by bear traps. This guy didn't even go to a hospital. This meant he had either been a poacher himself, or just one tough son of a bitch. Never found him, or heard about him since then. Still, finding a severed foot is never nice, especially when you know the type of shit that's out there. Peter once showed me an abandoned settlement he had found back in the day. Though we were roughly the same age, I was more of a city boy than him. He had always lived out in the less populated areas, and spent a lot of his childhood and teenage years on exploring the forest. He rarely talked about his childhood, mainly because of his alcoholic father who beat him and his mother. But he trusted me, and sometimes opened up, after a bottle or two. To him, exploring the wilderness was a way to escape from his dysfunctional home, which is why he had a pretty good internal map of the place. We drove for a couple of hours, until we arrived at the settlement. It looked rotten, and old as hell. Most of the buildings were made of wood, that was ready to collapse at any second. Some were made of your typical Soviet concrete, and looked about as stable as our economy. Still, we chose to explore for a bit, just in case. After all, this place would have made an amazing base for poachers. The houses were empty, except for some damp furniture and a couple of stoves. The concrete structures, on the other hand, still had some interesting stuff lying around. We found some wet boxes of old dynamite, which led us to believe that it was an old mining town. Sure enough, there was a large quarry a few kilometers away, which we found later. A lot of the stuff we found were too rusted to make out what it had once been, everything else was just in a state of decay. That made it seem pretty unsafe for us to fool around with it too much. It's not uncommon to find old abandoned mining towns that were never put on a map, so we didn't really take a second to wonder why it had been abandoned. That is, until we spotted the fucking deer. Peter anxiously nudged my shoulder, and gestured to the right of us. There was a large stag watching us from behind one of the houses. The more we looked around, the more deer we noticed. There were maybe 10 or 12 of them, just observing us. They didn't seem threatened by us, but rather like they were making sure we were on our way out of there. We slowly approached our ATVs as these fuckers just followed us silently, never blinking or making a sound. When we got to our ATVs, we debated whether or not we should light them up, but we decided against it, because we didn't want a herd of bloodthirsty demon deer charging us. We just started driving away, counting ourselves as lucky, seeing as they hadn't decided to fuck us up. I remember looking back, once we were 100 meters or so away, and seeing well over 20 deer standing there, motionless. "Fuck that," Peter shouted, as we raced out of the area, and back to town. We never went back, but often talked about it. He firmly believed that the deer had something to do with the settlement being abandoned. I'm not so sure, but I definitely don't think it's out of the question. Fuck deer and their mysterious fucking ways. At this point, the police knew of our various encounters. They didn't really believe us, but still respected us enough to not mock us. After all, we had retrieved quite a few bodies for them, that had been fucked to high hell by deer. That all changed when one of the officers, one of my friends, had gone missing. He had responded to a call about some kids that had claimed to have been stalked by a strange old man while they played in the forest. For some reason, he had gone out there alone to investigate. That was 16 hours ago, and nobody had heard from him since. Peter and I helped with the search, since we both knew him quite well. Hours of searching yielded nothing. Then, someone found his handgun lying on the ground. It had been fired twice, but we couldn't find the bullet casings. One of the officers had brought a search dog. It took a few whiffs of the gun, and started darting off into the woods, obviously tracing something. We followed as best as we could, but the damn thing was fast as fuck. Suddenly the woods were filled with the sound of aggressive barking and whining. We arrived at the spot where the dog had gone, and found, big surprise, a fucking deer. From one of its antlers hung the lifeless body of the officer. It had impaled him through his throat and out the mouth. It was so fucking grotesque, that I still get a lump in my throat when I think about it. He was my friend, and that fucking deer had killed him. It stood completely still, its head weighed down by the officer. The dog whimpered and snarled at it, but didn't move an inch closer to it. One of the police officers shot at it, which caused us all to just light it the fuck up. Retrieving his body still stands clear in my mind as one of the hardest things I'd ever done. After that incident, the officers always took our claims seriously. They even offered backup when we went on our excursions. I still wonder about that old man, though. Did the kids just imagine him? Peter still insisted that something supernatural was manipulating the deer, making them aggressive and batshit insane. I still leaned more towards the theory that deer are just, by their very nature, batshit insane. At one point we were checking out a potential poaching camp. When we arrived, we were greeted by two older men, who immediately started questioning us. We explained the situation to them, and asked them to step aside, so we could inspect their camp. It was a pretty standard camp, with some fresh kills and pelts. But the men seemed very nervous anyway, like they were hiding something. We started questioning them, until they cracked. They admitted that they had shot and killed about 7 or 8 deer the previous night. But they hadn't retrieved a single of their carcasses, and had simply fled the area. What kind of hunter kills animals, just to let them rot? Huh? Why the fuck did you do it? Peter asked them, with a sense of urgency in his voice. They explained that they had been sitting in a deer blind, waiting to take a decent shot at some unlucky deer. They then spotted one that walked straight at them. When they aimed at it, they saw its eyes through their scopes. It was looking directly at them, but still just walked calmly towards them. That's when they heard a twig snap, and realized their blind was being surrounded. All of them had the same lifeless look in their eyes. None of them made a noise, or any sudden movements. When they had completely surrounded the blind, they started pulling some aggressive expressions, and began bellowing at the hunters. Their blind was raised about 3 meters off the ground, and supported by 4 wooden pillars. The deer started ramming the supports, while they kept bellowing. The hunters were scared shitless, and just started shooting the deer one by one. They ran back to their camp after that, and hadn't been out hunting since. They showed us the way to their blind, and sure enough, there were several deer carcasses lying at the base of it. There were visible markings on the supports that backed up their claim. They then asked us if they were gonna get in trouble for what they had done. We told them no, as long as they didn't do anything with the carcasses, we wouldn't press charges. Normally we would have made them pay a fee, but seeing as they had been through an encounter with the psycho deer, we sympathized with them. In fact, we thanked them for taking care of them for us, since they were a threat to the locals. We told them that if they ever encountered aggressive deer, they should put them down immediately. They looked a bit puzzled, as we drove away. Never saw them again. Peter and I were once out on one of our excursions, when we ended up getting hunted by a pack of wolves. Normally, wolves tend to stay away from humans and avoid us at all costs. But this time they were literally chasing us, on our ATVs. I didn't really get a good look at their numbers, but I estimate that there were about 8 or 10 of them. They chased us for about a kilometer or so, when I accidentally ran directly into a tree, and got hurled through the air. I blacked out from the impact, but when I awoke, Peter was sitting beside me, having a smoke. It took me a moment or two, before I remembered what had happened. But when I looked around, there were no wolves to be seen. Where did they go? Did you scare them off? I asked Peter. He shook his head. I tried to scare them off, but they weren't even interested in you or me. He pointed towards my ATV. It was damn near ripped apart. They attacked it, and kept clawing, biting and ripping until they started bleeding out of their mouths. Several teeth were embedded in various places of the ATV. It didn't turn on. They had completely fucked the engine. Peter's ATV was completely unharmed. What the fuck, man? Had to leave the ATV behind and bum a ride off Peter. At this point, I was pretty sure nature just hated me. It became a sort of joke between Peter and me, that I had chosen the one job that required me to stay in nature for long durations at a time, only for nature to completely reject me. This is going to be the last of my posts. It's gonna be a long one, but it will describe the incident that eventually led me to move to Europe. I thank all of you in advance for reading my ramblings, and I especially thank those of you who believe me. It all started when Peter got a terrible idea. He suggested that we found a central point in the forest, perhaps near a lake, or anywhere deer were known to frequent. Then we would set up a blind in one of the biggest trees there, and camp out for a week or so, shooting any deer that seemed off. At first I called him a dumbass, seeing as our job was to preserve the wildlife rather than mow it down. To be honest, I was also terrified at the thought of spending an entire week in the middle of nowhere. He called me a pussy, and gave me an ultimatum: either you go with me, or I go out alone. I wasn't about to let my best friend go out there all by himself for a week. He probably knew that, and used it as bait. We drove to the local hardware store, and picked up the necessary equipment for our little project: screws, wooden planks, rope, etc., etc. Then we went shopping for other supplies, such as canned food and water. We loaded our ATVs with all our gear, and set off into the wilderness. I wondered why Peter suddenly wanted us to do something so rash and stupid, but figured he had just had enough. I didn't blame him. The weird thing was, though, we had actually not experienced anything unnatural for almost half a year up until that point. Part me wondered if he actually wanted to seek it out, for some reason. He never told me why he decided to lead this retarded crusade against the deer, but I still went with him so that I could watch his back. We eventually found a pretty large lake, surrounded by big, beautiful trees. It was early August, so we weren't in any danger of freezing to death while we slept. We started building our blind, which ended up being more of a wooden platform, 5 or 6 meters above the ground with a great view of the lake. By the time we were finished, the sun was setting. We had seen no sign of wildlife while we built our blind, but figured it was due to the amount of noise we made. Our plan had one huge flaw, that we had failed to realize. Fucking mosquitoes. We had no cover, and were placed right next to the goddamn mosquito capital of fucking Russia. We caught no sight of anything strange the first night, except for each other's swollen faces. At dawn the next day, we awoke to the sound of something splashing around in the water. We peeked over the edge of our blind, and saw a doe, along with 2 fawns. We observed them for about 15 minutes, before we determined that they were pretty normal. Similar incidents happened every once in a while the first couple of days, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt relieved, and wondered if they had migrated to some new place, planning on terrorizing some new rangers. But for some reason, Peter seemed extremely tense, and would curse under his breath. "Hey, Peter, WTF is going on, man?" He looked at me with a hollow expression, and sat up beside me. He explained that he had been having nightmares about the deer. He felt that if he killed some of them, he could prove to himself that he had nothing to fear. The poor guy hadn't had a decent night's sleep in well over a month at that point. He almost started crying while he told me these things, which really showed me how close this guy was to the edge. I had to help him, so I stayed with him and kept a lookout while he took a nap. I hadn't told him anything, but I had actually been looking into how much it would cost to move away from Russia. I hadn't said anything, because I wasn't really planning anything. Besides, I didn't feel like I could just leave him behind. I kept an eye on our surroundings for several hours, and almost decided to just lay back and enjoy the view of the lake, when I heard something approaching to our left. Out of the tree line stepped a lone stag. I waited a bit, to see if it would behave strangely before I woke Peter up. It bowed its head, and motioned as if it had started drinking from the lake, even though it wasn't anywhere near the lake's shore. That was more than enough proof for me, and I slowly shook Peter until he woke up. He instantly crawled over to the edge, and looked at the deer, grinning with some sort of sadistic satisfaction. He aimed at it with his rifle, and fired. A direct hit, straight to chest. He let out a sigh of relief and started laughing. We heard the sound of several animals walking around within the tree line, but never saw one of them. It almost seemed like that lone stag had been bait, to see how we would react. This only fueled Peter's paranoia. He was practically trembling with fear every time we heard something wander around in the tree line. Sometimes a deer would appear on the far side of the lake, but no matter how many times Peter and I shot at it, we never hit it. At night, our main source of light was a lantern that ran on petroleum. Part of me always suspected that it was a horrible idea to use that in a blind made of dry wood. The fifth night into our crusade, shit hit the fan. We kept spotting the eyeshine of several animals, but every time we looked through our scopes there was nothing. It felt like they were toying with us. Peter started firing shots into the air, trying to deter the creepy fuckers from whatever they were doing. But of course it didn't work. I picked up the lantern, and raised it higher, in order to illuminate the ground better. When I stand up, I get lightheaded, and fall over. I drop the lantern, which in turn starts a goddamn inferno. We abandon everything, and just descent down our rope. My rifle was up there, along with most of my favorite gear. As we stood there, in the night, the blazing blind illuminated a lot more than the lantern had. I still shudder at the thought. The largest flock of deer I had ever seen were standing in the tree line. All of their eyes were lit up from the flames, giving them a hellish appearance. Peter is practically hyperventilating at this point, and makes a dash towards our ATVs. We hit the ignition, and get the fuck out of there. We never looked back, to see if they followed or anything the entire ride back. We just kept driving, and letting out cries of adrenaline mixed with actual terror. When we got back, Peter just went home without saying a word. I went to my apartment and completely shut myself off from the rest of the world. Locked my door, closed the blinds and turned off my shitty phone. I stayed that way for a couple of days. Then I got the sudden urge to get a drink. I had already consumed every bottle of alcohol in my apartment, so I went to a bar that was located on my street. When I entered, I was met with worried looks from the people who knew me. "How are you doing?" the bartender asked me with a sympathetic tone. This surprised me, because none of them should have known about the shit Peter and I went through that past week. Could have been better. Why? I asked. "Well, after Peter's accident you just kind of disappeared for a little while." Peter's accident? What the fuck had happened while I was in my apartment? My expression made the situation pretty clear. "Oh shit man, I thought you knew." Then he filled me in. Peter had packed his bags, and rented some rundown car, with the intention of skipping town. He had taken off in a heavily intoxicated state, and had hit a tree at 120 kilometers per hour. The car was totaled, and Peter had died on the spot. After a few minutes of silence, I remember standing up, and just walking out of there. I walked around aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually I found myself back at my apartment complex. I noticed a piece of paper hanging out of my mailbox. I began tearing up. When I read it: "My dear friend, I have decided to leave this place. I can no longer bear the shadow that looms over us, and I hope you will come visit me someday. You helped me through some shitty times, but this time you can't help me. If you decide to come over, you can find me at XXXXXX, not exactly written like this, but you get the general idea." I cried for so long, that it seemed like an eternity. Still tear up, as I'm typing this. After about a month or so, I decided to move out of Russia and get a fresh start. I know I can never escape my past, or the nightmares that keep resurfacing, but I can put great distance between then and now. I still miss that crazy bastard every day, and will never forget what an amazing friend he was. I now live safely in the heart of a big city, far away from any forest. I sometimes go on drives through some of the more scenic woods, but it still feels so fake. European forests don't have the same raw feeling as the Russian forests. I sometimes miss my old home. I just wish there wasn't an abundance of terrifying animals roaming the woods. I haven't experienced anything unnatural since I moved, and I have finally learned to sleep properly at night. I regularly speak to a psychiatrist about some of my experiences, and feel more in control of my fears now. Well, that's my story. Believe it, if you will. Either way, it is very real to me. And next time you get the chance, please raise a glass to Peter. Honor his memory, and the man he was.